of course, the Taiwanese authorities have made it very clear that, okay, you can cross the median line, but, if you enter within the 12 nautical miles of our territorial sea and national airspace, then we will have to respond resolutely. So the Taiwanese have to draw the red line. But in a way, one will argue that the Taiwanese were forced to revise that red line. For example, Stolteneberg, himself, he could, probably, make a much more extensive regional tour, not just to, suppose, closer partners like Japan or South Korea, but try to branch out across the region, reach out to, say, Southeast Asia, for example, at least, to reassure that, no, that is not NATO's intention to expand its ambit to the region.
Welcome back to our channel. In today's video, from the escalating tensions between Indonesia and China to the strategic military procurements of Chinese arms by Thailand and Malaysia. Also, the implications of a NATO office in Japan. We can't miss discussing the far-reaching consequences of a significant event from last year and Nancy Pelosi's historic visit to Taiwan. So, grab your geopolitical maps and let's dive in.
Okay, great. So I would like to go back to your naval expertise and ask you a little bit about Indonesia as a naval power. They seem to have more and more conflicts, especially around the Natuna Islands with Chinese fishing boats and Coast Guard. And it seems like there is maybe, it's getting worse. So could you talk a little bit about Indonesia and its rising prowess, as a naval power? And what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the Indonesian Navy?
Okay. Indonesia is an archipelagic country. It's the largest archipelagic country in the world by size. And the issue here has always been that Indonesia, being a huge archipelagic country, has always found itself in a very deep conundrum. A deep conundrum where, it is multifaceted. On the one hand, at the societal level, there isn't necessarily a maritime mindset. So, which is the gist of, what the current Jokowi administration is so concerned about, that the wider general public in Indonesia isn't necessarily thinking the way as a maritime nation would. A maritime-minded society will thereby be more willing and also be more able to partake in the development of various maritime aspects. For example, developing the maritime economy, developing the shipbuilding industry, and of course, first and foremost, as this is what the conversation is more about, is in terms of the naval buildup, right? So all these, comes into play. It is a much broader issue than just a buildup itself. It goes back very much to the psyche of the Indonesian society, how they look at themselves as a maritime nation or not. So that is one. And so that leads us to, our discussions more broadly. It's not just about the naval capabilities. I mean, suffice to say is that Indonesia generally can be deemed to have underspent on defense for many years. If you look at, the allocations for its budget, a good bulk of its money goes into subsidies, goes into, some healthcare and other economic aspects. So by and large, it also harks back to the very old thinking in Indonesia during the Cold War, where it is mostly about internal security than external security. And so therefore, maintaining domestic stability is a much more overriding concern over anything else. So it's not to say that Indonesia don't need development. It needs a lot of money for development. It needs a lot of development generally. But I think that is where the catch-22 situation comes about. What comes first? Defense come first and then development, or the other way around. It is a cross-cutting issue, and I think the Indonesians so far has been trying to grapple with trying to seek the balance, the sweet spot in terms of balancing those socio-economic needs as well as the defense needs. And that does affect the Navy, because if we say that the Indonesians have underspent on defense for so many years, then the Navy is arguably the one that's faring the worst. Because if you look at the hierarchy of the armed forces, the Navy has never been at the top. The Army always get the lion's share of the funding. The Navy has for many years been getting, more or less, the remainder of what it is all about. Largely because, the Indonesian Navy has in peacetime largely performed as a constabulary force that deals with, say, counter illegal fishing and whatnot. So the thinking about the Navy becoming a serious warfighting apparatus has never been so seriously entertained until the more recent times with the Natuna issue that you mentioned, of course. Now, so in the recent times, obviously, under the current administration, there is a sort of reawakening that Indonesia needs a strong navy, so they are moving towards that direction. And then when they lost a submarine a couple of years back, it is a further awakening call that the navy is decrepit. Much of its equipment is so vintage and unusable, and they pose a serious operational and safety issue. So they need to be replaced quickly. But it's easy to say that, okay, we replace them quickly, but then the question is, where's the funding is going to come, right? And then it leads to another problem. If you don't put them into the state budget, then the other alternative is to seek loans for that. So this is one avenue that Jakarta is definitely turning to, is to seek favorable loans in order to finance the build-up. And some years ago, there was the talk about having a huge program. It's a $125 billion budget that is a multi-year defense build-up that is going to benefit, of course, the Navy. But then the question that leads on from the society is that, then where is the money going to come from? Does it mean that we take loans and thereby we are creating more debt? And Indonesia does have a huge debt issue that it is trying to grapple with as well. So it is a very complicated issue, because most people will say Indonesia definitely needs a bigger navy and stronger navy. But then the question has always been, how do you fund the build-up to begin with? That's one. It's not just about buying the equipment. Indonesian Navy personnel are not one of those most well-remunerated naval personnel around the world. Their welfare hasn't been the very best across the spectrum. So you need to also boost their welfare. So that is the other concern. And of course, besides buying the equipment, you still need to maintain the fleet itself. This is where the Indonesians are not necessarily doing that at the best of their ability sometimes. Some of their equipment... Sorry.
Yes, since you mentioned this, I think there is one additional layer. I think they have been so far procuring a lot of equipment from the Chinese. So that's, I think, also another problem. Like they're heavily Chinese dependent in their military equipment.
Maybe not so in the Navy, because so far from my understanding is that the Indonesian Navy definitely procure quite a bit of Chinese systems. Chinese systems such as close-in weapon systems, anti-ship missile systems that they use to retrofit on their existing equipment. Those older ships that dated from the Cold War, and then they use Chinese systems to essentially modernize them. It is true, but so far we have yet to see Indonesia actually buying complete naval platforms from China. The foremost preference that the Indonesian Navy has is always to seek Western sources, because that is where they believe they can get the top-of-the-line naval capabilities. But again, it goes back to the problem that I highlighted earlier, that, there's just not enough money to begin with. Let me give you an example. It would have been attractive to get Chinese. Look at Thailand, for example. With the budget that they were given and promised, they could probably just get one Western-built submarine. But, they need a working fleet, so they couldn't just settle on one submarine. They need a full package for that. So they turned to the Chinese. The Chinese gave them a very attractive price tag with a full package of 3 submarines. But of course, now there are many problems that came about. On hindsight, maybe it may not be a good idea, because the fine prints are not necessarily being read at all. So now they have the engine issue that you might be aware of. So now I think the other issue here is that, for example, the Malaysians, they got 4 patrol craft from China. They call that the littoral mission ships. And the original plan is they built the first pair in China, and then through a tech transfer, they will build the remainder. They actually planned for more than 12 ships in the class. Eventually, they stopped at 4, all 4 built in China, and they stopped the whole program. And then now they're thinking about batch 2 of the patrol vessels, and apparently they are not considering China. One of the reasons being that even though the ships are built new in China, the Malaysians were already encountering technical problems with the system. Some of the systems were not working very well. So there's a quality issue. So I believe this is also something that was reported in the Indonesian Navy some years back when there was a report, I think it's from Janes, that, when they're doing the missile live firing and it wasn't working. So I think there are some concerns about that. So, going forward, I don't think they are necessarily turning to Chinese. I think they will still look at Chinese options when it comes to, say, retrofits or getting some discrete subsystems that they will put on their platforms, whether new build or otherwise. But I think the drive here is where funding allows, they will prefer to either get it locally or they will want to get it from the Western sources or even from the South Koreans, for example. And now Japan comes to the picture. Japan is willing to transfer, the technologies for building frigates. And I think the Indonesians now have more options. So I think it does reduce the tendency of turning to China.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
Great. Thank you for the very extensive explanation. One thing I wanted also to clarify, we had recently the NATO summit and also the announcement of a NATO office in Japan. Wouldn't it be better, or wouldn't it improve the whole situation if maybe the US would clarify that it doesn't want to expand NATO into Asia? Because it seems a concern in Asia, definitely for the Chinese, because they're very afraid of it, they don't want to see it happening. But I also think other Asian countries might have the same concern. So do you think that might maybe ease the situation a little bit if the US stated, hey, it's just an office, we have 30 plus other offices globally in other countries, so that's just an office, nothing more?
I think along the line, there has been much earlier, assurances that were made by the US on associated issues. For example, there was earlier concerns by the Chinese, and they started to sort of make it part of the narrative that there is an Asian NATO in the making. And the US came out to say that the Quad, or anything that stems out from the Quad or from AUKUS isn't meant to be creating a NATO of Asia at all. So I think along those lines, I think the Americans have, probably said quite a lot, and probably they believe that they said enough of it, but it still wouldn't stop the Chinese from further, promoting the narrative that, there's an Asian NATO in the making, so we have to do something to it. Now, with the announcement that NATO has an interest in setting up a liaison office in Japan, and Japan obviously, appears very keen on that, given that it's also very keen to use it as a way to strengthen its ties with NATO. I think it further fits into the narrative. Within the region, I don't necessarily see many countries aligning to what China, and for that reason, Russia is thinking of and trying to put forward as a narrative about NATO. But at least we can see some unease that, will that mean that there will be a sharpening of the geopolitical rivalries and tensions in the region because of that? This sort of perception isn't necessarily to do with the fact that, NATO is seen as a threat per se, but more because NATO might be seen as a complicating factor in that. So US has said what it has been saying already, based on my knowledge over the past few years, on the other hand, maybe it would have been useful for NATO, for the NATO leadership. For example, Stoltenberg, himself, he could, probably, make a much more extensive regional tour, not just to, suppose, closer partners like Japan or South Korea, but try to branch out across the region, reach out to, say, Southeast Asia, for example, at least, to reassure that, no, that is not NATO's intention to expand its ambit to the region, because ultimately, if you go by the NATO charter, its geographical focus is, after all, Europe, right? So I think there is quite a bit of clarification that I think at the NATO level, it will be more useful rather than the US level to make.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was talking about. Yes, perfect.
Mm.
Thank you very much. The last question, because we're approaching an anniversary of last year Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So, what do you think? What's the result? The consequences? Was it needed? Was it not needed? I have my own view on this here from Taiwan. I have my doubts. I haven't been a fan since the very beginning, but there are also good sides about it. So, what's your take? Was it useful, helpful to Asia, or not?
Well, I think a number of Taiwanese will be cheering for that, and I understand, because it essentially conveys a certain legitimacy to Taiwan's identity, and it is something from the Taiwanese perspective, needs to be celebrated, of course. If you ask, from an outsider perspective, I think this is what I've been hearing as well, is to question, is it necessary at all, right? I mean, it is symbolic, but if it's symbolic and merely just symbolic, then the consequences that it bring about, is it necessary to take the risk at all in the first place? And so this is what I believe to be, a rather commonly heard perception around the region, especially in Southeast Asia, questioning, the wisdom of having a visit, as symbolic as it is, whether it is worth the type of consequences that came about. Meaning, ramping up the tensions in the Taiwan Strait, and essentially, if one could think about it, probably given the Chinese more reasons to justify what they are doing now in the Taiwan Strait. And of course, based on your question, I think that dovetails very well to what I'm going to talk about. If you look at it, almost 1 year since that crisis where the Chinese started doing the sort of round island exercise, or what they call combat patrol, and then they were essentially simulating what many of us have seen to be an air and naval blockade of Taiwan. I mean, this was a rare opportunity for the PLA, right? Because they may have draw plans, they have contingency plans, but they are always waiting for an occasion to test it out. Now, with Nancy Pelosi's visit, it probably created the opportune moment for them to do that. And using that, they are essentially justifying what they are doing. For example, challenging the median line. And ever since Pelosi's visit, the incursions across the median line has become a norm. Therefore, of course, the Taiwanese authorities have made it very clear that, okay, you can cross the median line, but, if you enter within the 12 nautical miles of our territorial sea and national airspace, then we will have to respond resolutely. So the Taiwanese have to draw the red line. But in a way, one will argue that the Taiwanese were forced to revise that red line because of that. Because it used to be the median line. Now it has to be the 12 nautical mile. So in a way, it might not have actually, enhanced Taiwan's security, and it might have actually constrained options for both the mainland China as well as for Taiwan. Of course, the converse argument is that with or without Nancy Pelosi's visit, that is a Chinese intention anyway, is to continue to challenge the status quo in the Taiwan Strait and to push Taiwan in the gray zone anyway. That is another perspective. But, at least to me, from my perspective, is that why give them an obvious reason to do that in the first place, right? I mean, end of the day, you ask yourself, is it necessary? And to Taiwanese, I mean, no offense to my Taiwanese friends, but, maybe to them it is something that is really to be encouraged, but I don't know whether it has created some downstream problems going forward for the deterrent strategy.
If you believe in me, please like it, leave a comment and share the show with friends. It might not look like it, but I have quite a lot of expenses. I am not asking for money, only for support. The goal of this program is to spread the knowledge.
Yes, and not only, as you mentioned, the restrictions with regard to Taiwan's space, the Taiwanese Ministry of Defense recently also revised the ADIS line. So it's a smaller, more closer to Taiwan ADIS. So actually they had to pull back on a few issues. Yeah, so I'm not saying the visit was good or bad. It had its advantages, disadvantages. But in general, if we could go back in time, I think maybe this shouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Just anything you would like to add, something you're maybe working on, any research maybe you would like to share, something that you think you would like to discuss or publish soon?
I recently published with the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network, that is a think tank based in Seoul, on confidence and security building measures in the maritime domain, focused on Southeast Asia. So, if you are interested, feel free to take a look. It is free for download, so it's openly available. If not, my contact details are always on the RSS website, so you can just contact me. I will just share with you a copy of the publication. Or, even if you just want to have a discussion, freely on those related issues, just feel free to pop me a line. And of course, the same invitation goes to you, Richard. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I will put a link in the description so it's for everyone available. Yeah. Collin, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was very, very interesting. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Yeah, allow me to thank you, Richard, for having me on your show and give me the opportunity to share my views. I look forward to work with you again.